UFC Fight Night. Edwards versus Brady. The UFC heads to the O2 Arena in London, which for my money is the best venue for the sport. The crowd is always absolutely electric. The fights always feel like the stakes are just a little bit higher. Not a pay-per-view, so we're getting it included on ESPN+. Super excited for this card. A lot of solid fights, a lot of UK talent. Let's break it down. First off, we have Guram Kutateladze taking on Kauê Fernandes. Guram is one of these kind of controversial guys in the lightweight division in terms of, people thought he was next up for a little bit. Injuries kind of plagued him, and now he's in one of these tough positions. He's fighting guys, fighting just kind of random competition. He's coming off of a fight versus Jordan Vucenic, who is featured later on in this card. And he looked really good in that matchup. I mean, Vucenic had a lot of success early, especially in the grappling, but Guram was able to turn it around. That's kind of his MO. He's going to do it on the ground. He's got some good kicks, though, on the feet. I definitely think if this is a straight stand-up fight, Kauê's would have a significant power advantage. I think his hands are a lot better. But I expect Guram to be able to mix in the grappling a bit and win a decision here. He's going to have to avoid some big strikes late from Kauê Fernandes, though, because Guram can get a bit tired and start getting tagged later in fights. After that, we have Nathan Fletcher taking on Caolán Loughran. I do recognize Nathan Fletcher from the Ultimate Fighter season. He ended up beating fellow contestant Ziggy Regimontis in his UFC debut. Got a submission win there, pretty much. That's what he does. He's looking for subs. He's got 7 submission wins. I think it's like 4 rear naked chokes, 3 triangles. And that really is kind of the style of the whole gym he's from. Like, that's what they do. I think he's trains at the same gym as Paddy, which Paddy is, well known for his submissions. His opponent has never been submitted, but Loughran did just lose to Jake Hadley, who moved up from flyweight, and he didn't look particularly good in that fight. A fight that I thought he was going to really be able to kind of manhandle Jake Hadley. So I think Fletcher can give Caolán Loughran his first submission loss here. Next up is Shauna Bannon taking on Puja Tomar. There's not many fights to go off of here for either fighter, but at the same time, I think there kind of is enough tape to kind of put together a decent idea of how this fight's going to play out. I mean, Puja, she scrapped together a win in her UFC debut versus, not the highest level of competition. Shauna Bannon is 2-1 in the UFC, with her only loss being to Bruna Brazil, but she looked okay in her 2 other fights. She'll have the crowd backing her. I think she's going to be a bit bigger than Puja Tomar, and I think her grappling is a bit better, which a lot of times ends up being the deciding factor in these fights. So we're taking Bannon by decision. Next up is a middleweight matchup between Christian Leroy Duncan and Andrey Pulyaev. CLD is looking for his first big UFC win, and this isn't really the fight to do it because no one's ever heard of Andrey Pulyaev unless you're watching the Dana White Contender Series like me. I thought CLD was going to have a bit more success than he has had up to this point. He really struggled against RoboCop, who was his hardest opponent to date, and he just looked small in there, which most people do next to RoboCop, but it definitely felt pretty significant, and it wasn't as much a height gap as it was just like he just looks like he has a smaller frame, much more slender, and the power is definitely kind of questionable from CLD. He's got powers in his kicks, but I don't think we've seen him really rock people with his hands in the UFC up to this point, at least anyone who's halfway decent. Pulyaev has been an underdog in Dana White Contender Series, and he's a big underdog in this fight. He had a pretty bad amateur record, but I thought he looked solid in a Dana White Contender Series fight. So, I don't know. CLD is going to have the home crowd. I think he's going to be a lot faster, and that's really going to be the story here. I think he'll end up putting up a bit of a clinic on the feet, working his kicks, teeps, and win this one on the cards. After this, we have Marcin Tybura taking on Mick Parkin in the heavyweight division. Parkin is 10-0 in his career. Tybura will probably be his biggest test up to this point. I say that not because, Tybura is probably the best fighter right now, because Tybura is kind of getting up there in age. But he hasn't really fought a grappler of Tybura's level yet, which I think is going to be a big test because he's still kind of an unknown on the feet. I think he was going to pass it, though. Tybura's looked pretty slow, and Parkin did get a big KO win over Lucas Bresky, so we know that the power is there, and it was one of those, one shot, one punch, and he's out, so, it's important that you have that kind of, the consequences are there when you're in the heavyweight division. And at the end of the day, he's, in there with Tom Aspinall training all the time, so that's definitely going to make a big difference here. We're taking Mick Parkin by KO in this matchup. Next fight is Loner Kavanagh taking on Felipe dos Santos. 2025 has kind of been the year of the defeateds, basically undefeated guys losing their zeros. We've seen it happen a ton of times. I mean, we're definitely in the double figures by now. But I don't really see that happening here. Loner Kavanagh is one of these up-and-coming guys who I'm definitely believing in him. He's just so explosive, and he's got rare power for 125. You don't often see, guys getting put out with one shot at 125, and that's what he's done, or at least did in his Dana White Contender Series fight. Felipe dos Santos is going to be a really solid test, especially on the feet. And, he's crafty, and he's going to give him some different looks. But I think Kavanagh's speed is going to be pretty apparent. I think he's going to be a lot better boxer in this one and wins this one by decision. Next up is Jai Herbert taking on Chris Padilla. Padilla is 2-0 in the UFC, both by finish. He was on a five-fight finish streak leading into the UFC, so, he had 3 finishes before then, but he wasn't in, the biggest. It's not like he was coming from, Bellator, PFL, really. I wasn't too familiar with the promotion he was fighting in before this. At least I don't recall what it was. But, yeah, he looked really good in his last fight. He fought Rongju, pretty much dismantled him. Not the best competition. Jai Herbert's going to be his best opponent. And I think Herbert can give him some issues with his length. I think Jai Herbert had the better peak out of these two. I mean, he became LFA champ, and he hasn't really put it together in the UFC up to this point, but he's fought and beat some really good guys in there. I think Jai Herbert is just going to be able to land a lot of shots on the feet and avoid the big shots coming his way from Chris Padilla and win by decision. Bit of a decision fest here so far, and that leads us into our next fight, which is Nathaniel Wood taking on Morgan Charrière. Charriere's 2-1 in the UFC with 2 KOs. Some notable losses in his career are to Paul Hughes and Jordan Vucenic when he was fighting in Cage Warriors, 2 really solid guys. Charrière seems to have built himself a big French fan base. I'm solely basing that on all the people he got out to be in his music video, hype video of his fight. I don't know what. They're moving differently in France, definitely, the way they hype up their guys. I appreciate it. Charriere's got a lot of power, good striking. And he's taking on a really good striker in Nathaniel Wood, who honestly is one of the most underrated fighters and one of my more underrated favorite fighters. The guy is just so slick. And he's just, satisfying to watch. I don't know if there's anyone else in the UFC I can name that's really like it, where you're just oh, that guy is, just so slick. Especially when he's landing and stuff. He really just looks good in there. This is going to be a tough fight. I think there's going to be a bit of a power imbalance. Charriere's got that, one-punch knockout power that I don't know we really have from Nathaniel Wood. But Wood, I mean, he's got a better career record in terms of win percentage, And he's just such a hard matchup, I think. And he's finally going to be fighting someone who's comparable in size and reach. And I think that's going to benefit him a lot. He's not going to have to deal with like a big reach disadvantage, but I think we sometimes see from Nathaniel Wood. We're taking Wood by decision. Next fight is Jordan Vucenic taking on Chris Duncan. We talked about his fight with Guram. That was back in August of last year. A fight that he lost, but he gained a lot of stock despite losing that fight. And he really had Guram on the ropes at some points there. He's a guy who's, he wants to win with his grappling. We haven't seen him really show out on the feet up to this point. He hasn't really had to in most of his fights because he wants to take you down. I mean, honestly, kind of a similar style to Sean Brady almost. I mean, maybe that's crazy to say, and maybe I'm also saying that because they're both like fully tatted out. But I do see a kind of similar style grappling heavy approach there. His opponent, Chris Duncan, has put together a 3-1 record in the division. Some of those wins are not the strongest. Like, I know Yunal Moose broke his hand in the first round. But still, he's done everything he could in those fights. He beat the guys in front of him. He's coming off of a submission win over Pulyaev, where he landed a guillotine in the first round. Put him out cold. His wrestling definitely isn't the best. So I could see Vucenic taking advantage of that. And I don't know if I really trust Chris Duncan off of his back, especially if he's going to jump. If he tries to jump a Gilly versus Vucenic, I don't think that's going to end very well for him. Vucenic's just a lot higher level of grappler than Pulyaev. That being said, I think he can give Vucenic a lot of issues on the feet, though, and if he does fight off the takedowns, I think he can land some really hard shots. I think Chris Duncan can win this one by decision as a big underdog. Next up is Molly McCann taking on Alexia Thainara. Never heard of Thainara until now. She won her Dana White Contender Series fight, and she's coming in with a pretty solid record. But if you've watched my videos, you know that I'm skeptical of pretty much any of the strawweight records prior to the UFC. Those wins just don't mean a whole lot, which you could honestly say about pretty much any division. But compare that to Molly Meatball, who's obviously had a pretty up and down career. I think she's looked a little better since moving down a weight class, but still hasn't seen a whole lot of sustained success. But we still know that she's got that UFC experience, and she can, beat a lot of the UFC level talent. And based on that alone, I'm going to take Molly McCann to win this one by decision. Next up is Gunnar Nelson taking on Kevin Holland. In the welterweight division, this was a pretty straightforward one for me. I'm never picking Kevin Holland against a grappler again, and Gunnar Nelson is a grappler, so that's pretty much all I need to hear. Yes, Kevin Holland, both of his losses were against middleweights in DeRitter and Kutateladze. We faded him in both of those fights, and Nelson is pretty inactive. He fights once a year, if that, but he came out in his last fight, got a submission over Brian Barberena, and he always looks like he's in pretty solid shape, and I think that's really all it's going to take, given his grappling acumen, to beat Kevin Holland. Our co-main event is Jan Blachowicz taking on Carlos Ulberg. I am heavily invested in this fight. I planted my flag early last year that Carlos Ulberg was going to be the champ by the end of 2025. The clock is ticking, but he's doing all he can to put himself in the position to get a title shot. And listen, I think he has a chance here. The light heavyweight division is kind of in a weird place. If Pereira wants the rematch, he's getting the rematch. There's no question about that. And I think he obviously will take that fight versus Ankalaev. I guess it's just a matter of when. Is he going to even let Ulberg, or is the UFC going to let Ulberg potentially fight if Pereira wants to take some time off? Who knows? But Ulberg is definitely fighting for a title shot potentially here. Even if Pereira were to take the rematch, I don't know if Oldberg would necessarily really need to fight again if he gets a win versus Jan Blachowicz. But first things first, he has to get through Blachowicz. Yeah, I like Oldberg's game. He has that, somewhat extensive kickboxing background. He's 12-1. His only UFC loss was to Kennedy Nzechukwu, who's just a behemoth, and he got caught on the cage, and, that's all it takes in this division. But he's looked good in all of his other fights. I mean, he's coming off of that Volkan Ozdemir fight where I think he comfortably won. I think a lot of people would have liked to see a finish, especially because he was coming off of like 3 or 4 straight finishes leading into that fight. But that's not how it shakes out all the time. Ozdemir is a really tough opponent. If this was prime Blachowicz, this would be a tough one to pick, a really tough one to pick. I would probably be leaning Blachowicz. If this was the prime Polish power days back in like 2020. But that Polish power we haven't really seen since that Reyes fight in 2020. I mean, he doesn't have a finish since then. He's had a couple of, he had the big win over Adesanya, but that was kind of, he leaned on his grappling. I don't think he had ever landed any massive shots. Of course, he had the Ankalaev fight where the leg kicks were kind of the story, and he was able to get a draw in that fight. So I don't know. If there's a weight class where age is going to not affect you a whole lot, it's going to be light heavyweight. Obviously, we know that. But at a certain point, we just really haven't seen it from Blachowicz in a while. I don't see why it would just come back now versus Carlos Oldberg, who's got a lot more to fight for. He still is looking for his first chance at the belt here. So we're taking Oldberg to win this one by decision. It's going to be tough to put Blachowicz out. He only has 3 rounds to do it. But if he does manage to find a KO, what am I saying, dude? We're flipping to KO. We're manifesting this title shot. We're taking Oldberg by KO. And I don't usually like changing my picks, but you know what? Things just started clicking. And Blachowicz is a guy who's been knocked out a few times in his career. It's been a while, but Oldberg's going to be a lot faster, and I think he can get it done. Finally, we have our main event. It's Leon Edwards versus Sean Brady in the welterweight division. Of course, Leon's last fight versus Bilal pretty much exposed and summed up all of his flaws, which is, a lack of urgency at times, and, issues with his gas tank. He kind of fades late in fights. We've seen that in the first Kamaru Usman fight. Even in the second Usman fight, he tired out a bit. And Bilal, a guy who's got a phenomenal motor and, is willing to be aggressive, just really took advantage in that matchup. And yeah, I was pretty disappointed in what we saw out of Leon. At a certain point, if your coach is screaming at you to, to bring more intensity as often as that seems to be happening, I don't know. Maybe there's something going on. Maybe it's really just his, like he said in the first Kamaru Usman fight, he said his body just wasn't reacting like he wanted it to, and they were at altitude, and that all makes sense. But at a certain point, it's just maybe this guy just doesn't have great conditioning, and it's just something he has to deal with in terms of pacing himself. But obviously, we know that the strengths are still there. He still is just so skilled on the feet, and Bilal got the best of him on the feet, which was surprising, but again, yeah, that fight just never was great from the start. This will be a really good indicator of where Leon's at in his career if he, is looking good on the feet, and if he's willing to really I think he needs to put a little bit more on his punches at times. I think he's too content to just throw stuff out there. And versus Bilal, we saw that Bilal just wasn't scared of what was coming back his way, at any point on the feet. And if that's the case in this fight, I think that could leave the door open for a guy like Sean Brady, who's gonna push the pace on the feet, and then definitely in the grappling, I think Sean Brady can really take advantage of that. We know that he's super skilled on the ground. Like, if he takes Leon down, I don't know if Leon's going to be able to get back up. And I think Leon's takedown defense is actually pretty underrated early on in fights. Like, the guy's got great wrestling. The problem is he just gets exhausted and, doesn't really have the energy to fight takedowns late in the fight. I see Sean just pushing the pace early on in this fight. And, I think Leon's going to fight off a few takedowns early, and then just the pressure is going to be too much, and he's not going to be able to fight the takedowns. And I could feasibly see him spending the last 2 rounds of this fight on his back versus Sean Brady, who's just going to be relentless with the takedowns. And I think Brady wins the decision. So with that is the card. Really looking forward to this one. If you're in the States, starts at, early afternoon, which I absolutely love. Sleep in, roll out of bed, fights are on. You really can't beat it. We will catch you on the next one. Thanks for watching.